Shabbat Shalom. Some of you know, as part of my academic program towards becoming a rabbi, I have to take a series of exams on Bereshit Rabbah, the collection of midrash on the book of Genesis. Bereshit Rabbah starts with midrash on Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, goes all the way to midrash on the death of Joseph at the end of Genesis chapter 50. And I'm proud to say that after 3 months of intense studying, I finally reached the part of Genesis where Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's slow going, but there's just so much interesting material that my study partner and I want to analyze rather than skipping past it. And it's one of those teachings that we encountered that I want to talk about today. In fact, it's the second midrash in the entire collection, which makes you think it might be important. But it actually has a source not in Genesis, but in an unusual verse in this week's Parsha, in Dvarim. As I mentioned, Dvarim is Moses' monologue to the Jewish people, recounting everything that happened up to that point. But the verses that we read today in chapter 2, not so much a monologue, more like a travelogue. We went through Seir, to the wilderness of Moab, to the land of the Ammonites. And then there's this very odd digression in verse 23, which I'll quote in English translation. The Avim, who dwelt in villages in the vicinity of Gaza, the Kaftorim, who came from Crete, wiped them out and settled in their place. And then it's back to our regular programming about where the Israelites traveled to. So why is this seemingly superfluous verse there? Why do we need to know that the land of the Avim, whoever they are, were conquered by the Kaftorim, whoever they are? Why does the holy text of the Jewish people make a point to awkwardly include a record of two other nations fighting each other? Here's the answer in the Midrash of Bereshit Rabbah from Rabbi Yoshua of Sichnin, who said in the name of Rabbi Levi, if non-Jews rebuke the people of Israel and say, you are a nation of robbers, in other words, criticize the Israelites by saying that they robbed the land from the Canaanites whom they defeated in battle, the Jewish people, the rabbis continue, the Jewish people can respond right back. And you, is your own land not in your hands by robbery? Is it not so that the Kaftorim who came from Crete wiped out the Avim and settled in their place? The world and all its contents belong to the Holy One of blessing. That's the end of the Midrash. We can see from this two things. One is that for 1,500 years, Jews have loved answering questions with questions of their own. And two, even 1,500 years ago, Gentiles were accusing Jews of having stolen land. Back then, we were accused of stealing land from the Canaanites. Now, we are accused of stealing land from the Palestinians. As the good book says, Ein chadash tachat hashemesh, there is nothing new under the sun. I want to talk about this today, not just because it's tied to this week's Parsha, but also because we're in back-to-school season. College students are heading back and likely to encounter more anti-Israel protests, including the kinds that all too often descend into anti-Semitism. And this line about stolen land was one of the most frequent argument that protesters used in the last year. Chant at Duke University, justice is our demand, no peace on stolen land. At NYU, shut down sites where students are banned, Tel Aviv is stolen land. At Columbia, one protester was quoted as shouting, no peace on stolen land, we want all the land, we want all of it, which doesn't rhyme, but at least has the advantage of being clear about what they mean. They're not protesting the Israeli government's expropriation of West Bank farmland without sufficiently compensating Palestinian farmers. That's a real problem that Israeli civil society groups have been trying to stop for years, but that's not what these protesters are talking about. What they're saying is that the state of Israel itself is an illegitimate enterprise because all of Israel, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, from the Golan to Eilat, is land stolen from the Palestinian people. As these protests were heating up in the spring, I noticed a trend among Jewish supporters of Israel who were claiming that the pro-Palestinian students were brainwashed. And I've had conversations with Jewish students who were involved in the encampment at Columbia, the pro-Palestinian encampment. And I have to say they're very smart and very committed to Judaism. And using language like brainwashed makes it much harder to actually have a productive conversation. I want to be clear, it's obvious to me that many of the anti-Israel protests throughout New York City, throughout the country, on campus, off campus, are led by people who genuinely support the murder of Jewish civilians. And those people are not worth engaging with. But if you want to convince people to change their minds, you have to engage with them at the level that they're at, not convince yourself that they're mindless automatons. If you're able to have a productive conversation with a reasonable campus protester, my recommendation is that it's not useful to talk about 2023 or 1948 and who did what to who. What's useful is talking about 1947, when the United Nations voted to partition mandatory Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. And of course, David Ben-Gurion and the Jewish leaders accepted two states, and the Arab leaders rejected it and started a war that became Israel's war for independence. But when you bring up 1947, the protesters, what they'll say in response is, what gave the UN the right to make that decision in the first place? And I think that's a reasonable question. What did give the UN the right to make that decision? Nobody in mandatory Palestine, Jewish or Arab, voted to have the UN make the call. And the UN itself has a really problematic structure if you think about it, right? The United Kingdom gets a veto at the UN Security Council, but India, its former colony, doesn't, even though India is the most populous country in the world. The question, what gave the UN the right, is worth taking seriously. The answer to that question is that the British controlled mandatory Palestine and really didn't want to deal with it anymore. And so they gave the UN the permission to come up with a solution, but then the protester will say, well, what gave the British the right to control mandatory Palestine in the first place? And the answer is, they won World War I, and the Ottoman Empire lost, and so Britain took over a lot of Ottoman territory as a result, including the land of Israel. To which the protester will say, well, just because the Allies won World War I, did that give them the right to gather a bunch of European aristocrats and draw arbitrary lines on the map, creating illogical borders that are still causing problems across the Middle East, not just in Israel, but across the Middle East 100 years later? This is also a very reasonable question, and you can't answer them by saying, oh, you're brainwashed. You can answer them by saying, the United Nations Charter, which every country in the world has signed on to, guarantees self-determination of peoples, and the partition plan was, and the two-state solution is, the best way to create self-determination for both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people. You can answer by saying a country is judged not by how it treats its majorities, but how it treats its minorities. And Israel's certainly not perfect in this regard, but it's committed in its founding document to protect the rights of its Arab minority, while Hamas is committed in its founding document to kill every Jew it can find. Or you can answer by taking the lesson from our midrash. The midrash says that the Jewish people should say, you think we stole the land of Israel? Well, who did you steal your land from? In the 20th century, after the horrors of World War II, the global community made it illegal under international law to conquer land through war. Now, if you fight a war and you conquer land, you have to give it back when the war is over. This is a dramatic change from all of human history before this, when conquering land was totally acceptable. But this change makes sense. In order to preserve peace, we don't want countries to think that it's okay to start wars of conquest. Russia should not be allowed to conquer land from Ukraine, and God willing, when that war is over, they should have to give that land back. And so too, just because the British defeated the Ottomans in battle, the 21st century consensus is they shouldn't have taken possession of Ottoman lands, and the fact that they did caused a lot of problems. But here's the thing. If you say the British stole the land from the Ottomans, well, then the Ottomans stole the land from the Crusaders. And the Crusaders stole the land from the Caliphate, who stole the land from the Byzantines, and on and on and on. In the Middle East, all land is stolen from someone else. Or to put it another way, there's no such thing as stolen land, because no part of the world belongs to any one group. As the Midrash says, the world belongs to God, the Holy One of blessing. Indigenous people should have the right to live in their homelands and to practice their traditions, but no indigenous group has an inherent right to own or control the land more than another indigenous group from the same place. And the Jewish people certainly are one of the indigenous groups of the land of Israel. We have so much evidence for this. Our language, Hebrew, is a Semitic language native to the Eastern Mediterranean. There's so much archaeology, not just in Israel itself, but in Egypt and Assyria and Babylonia, where there's tablets and carvings on pyramids that refer to the Hebrews or Israelites or Judeans. There's DNA tests showing not only are Ashkenazi Jews related to Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, but also we're all pretty closely related genetically to Palestinians and Bedouin and Druze. There's so much evidence. There's only one source that's widely accepted today that denies that the Jews are indigenous to Israel. Only one widely accepted source. And that source is the Torah. The Torah is very clear. The first Jew was not from Israel. Abraham, the first Jew, was from Ur in what's now Iraq. And he followed God's instruction, Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladcha mibeit avicha el haaretz asher arecha. Go forth from your native land, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. Now look, this would not be the only time that the Bible says something happened, but historians are skeptical. And I want to be clear that the fact that this is part of the book of Genesis by no means invalidates historical Jewish claims to ancestry or indigenous status in the land of Israel. But the question you should always ask when you read the Torah is, why is it this way and not another way? In other words, why is it important that our ancestor came from somewhere else to the land of Israel? Some indigenous cultures tell stories about themselves that they were always in that place, that they were formed from the earth of that place. So why is the story that God wants us to know, or the story that we tell ourselves, such that even though we love the land of Israel and we think of it as holy, that we trace our roots back there and we long for a day in the world to come where all of us will live there in peace? Why are we reminded in the Torah that we aren't its original inhabitants? One of the ways I like to think about the Torah is that the Torah is both of its time and for all time. As conservative Jews, we read the Torah with two eyes. One that sees it as a historical record of how Jews thought about the world in ancient Israel, and one that sees it as a document that gives us direction of how we should think about the world today in America in 2024, or wherever we may find ourselves in the future. One answer to this question is that we're taught that the first Jew, Abraham, was an immigrant in order to remind us of our obligations to immigrants. As we're reminded again and again, the Torah, just one example from Leviticus, the stranger who sojourns with you shall be to you as your citizens. You shall love each one as yourself. Love the stranger. Love the immigrant. But we also get that lesson from the many, many times in the Torah that we're reminded to treat strangers well because we were strangers in the land of Egypt, right? That happens so much in the Torah, so that Abraham was an immigrant is helpful in that regard as supporting evidence, but it doesn't fully explain why this is the story we have. The answer comes when we read the part of the Torah where Sarah's died, and Abraham's looking for a burial plot for her in the city of Hebron, which is in the West Bank. It's part of the biblical land of Israel. And the local Hittites offer to give this immigrant, Abraham, a burial site for free. But he refuses their free offer and insists repeatedly on paying full price. He bows down low to the ground and says, repeatedly bows, and says, Ger v'toshav anochi, I am a resident alien among you. I am an immigrant among you. He is encountering people who have been in the area for far longer than him, and he makes a point to act respectfully and deferentially, and is scrupulous in ensuring that any sale or transfer of land is done fairly. This is the type of language and attitude that the Torah says we should have towards people who are here in the country in which we now live before us. And any student of American history knows that Abraham's respectful behavior and paying a fair price for buying land is exactly the opposite of the decisions that white leaders made with the Native Americans who were here in this land before them. If the teachings of the Torah are going to be relevant to us today, then on the one hand, we have the teaching of the midrash that reminds us that every piece of land was at one point conquered by someone. And we know that there are Native American tribes that were wiped out long before 1492 because their lands were taken over by other Native American tribes. But on the other hand, we have the teaching of the story of Abraham insisting that we respect the Native Americans who were on this land before us, and therefore implying that if we've done them wrong, we have an obligation to rectify and repair. And by the way, I don't want to imply that being Jewish and Native American are discrete categories. We know there's Native Jews all over North America, but for non-Native Jews, the lesson is that it's incumbent on those of us who've benefited from Native dispossession to at the very least acknowledge it. Beyond that, perhaps to follow in the footsteps of Abraham and support policies that ensure that our government keeps its promises that it made to the tribes, or fairly compensates them for the land they acquired. It's important to remember this Tisha B'Av as we mourn how the Jewish people were exiled from our homeland to Babylonia and Rome, that we're having services on land once occupied by the Lenape people, who were exiled from their homeland to Oklahoma and Wisconsin. And it's important to remember, if we're having an argument on campus or otherwise, that uses the framework of indigeneity and stolen land, that if we follow that argument to its conclusion, that Jews have more of a right to live in Israel than they do in the United States. These debates about the legitimacy of Israeli and Palestinian claims to the land are probably going to continue for as long as peace remains elusive. But just as Tisha B'Av is followed by the hope of high holidays, the Shabbat of admonition is followed by the Shabbat of comfort. We can pray that, God willing, speedily in our days, we'll see a day when war and bloodshed cease, when a great peace will embrace the whole world, and all who live on earth shall realize that all land belongs to God, who has brought us into being to praise, to labor, and to love. Shabbat Shalom.